Okay, kia ora koutou, everyone. Welcome to our next OERC seminar, part of the series that we're running looking at COVID-19 disruption and what that might mean for new energy futures. Before I introduce today's speaker, just a couple of notes. We are recording the session so that it will be available up on our website afterwards if you want to look at it again. Our next seminar is October 21st, and we'll have Karen Silk from Westpac talking to us about what Westpac is doing in the energy finance area to support energy transitions. And also want to draw your attention to our 14th annual research symposium on the 19th and 20th of November. So we'll be accepting abstracts shortly, and you can find all of that information up on our website. All right. Very, very pleased to welcome Jinty to today's seminar. Jinty MacTavish is the Principal Policy Advisor in the Sustainability area for the Dunedin City Council, where she's been doing a lot of work around the city's zero carbon plan and the energy plan, and of course previously served as a councillor with the DCC, so I'm sure familiar to many of us, and really look forward to sort of the high-level overview of what's been going on in the council space in this area. And so Jinty will talk to us for about 20 minutes or so, and that will leave us with lots of time to ask questions and to have a broader discussion around what this might mean for us all moving forward. So without anything further, I'll hand it over to Jinty.
Kia ora, Sean, and kia ora koutou katoa. I see some familiar faces lined up there, so hi to all of you that I know, and nice to connect with those of you that I don't know. As Sean said, today is going to be a bit of a parachute view of what's going on at the DCC. Obviously, I can only speak to it from an officer perspective rather than from a councillor perspective, so you'll be getting facts and figures and things from me rather than a political view. I guess the context for this is that we are heading into a 10-year planning exercise at the council, which is something that it's a bit of a misnomer in the sense that it does actually happen once every 3 years, but it's a budgetary exercise that looks out 10 years and puts in place, or it's an opportunity for a conversation with the community really about what priorities there might be for the coming decade and how those might be financed. So in that context, the whole zero carbon and COVID response issues are obviously pretty topical, and yeah, so it's a neat time to be involved in some of this work here at the DCC. So I guess starting with some context, at the DCC, our climate change work programme has got two key parts. This climate change work programme in its kind of current form, which is sort of a formalised thing, has only really been in place since the beginning of the 2019-20 year, so that's about July 2019. That was when council put some dedicated funding into the budget for staff resourcing to progress some of this work. It has two components, a mitigation focus and an adaptation focus. The adaptation work has probably had a bit more momentum behind it in many ways because council's been doing some work in that space for a number of years now. And so in that stream, it's just kind of been picking up the pace. And we're not going to talk much about that today, but many of you will be familiar with the South Dunedin Future work. In the mitigation space, things are really just kicking off. So we'll talk extensively about what's happening in the mitigation space today. I also hold the energy portfolio for the council at the moment. It's a bit of a temporary, hopefully a fairly temporary position until we have some more dedicated resourcing in that area. So I guess this is what our climate change work program currently looks like. On the left there, that's the mitigation focus, and we call it Zero Carbon 2030, and I'll come to the reason for that shortly. Obviously within that, we as a major employer in the city and an entity that runs a range of public services, we also have our own emissions as an organisation that we need to manage and to reduce as a contribution towards citywide emissions reduction. So the work that is done on internal emissions is essentially a subset of that broader work on city emissions. On the right is the adaptation program with the focus on South Dunedin future. And then obviously in the middle there is some overlap, some things that deliver on both mitigation and adaptation. And we've had a couple of initiatives underway this year that are working in that overlap area. One of them was called a Climate 2030 Rapid Review, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail shortly. But the council has also made a commitment to something called the Global Compact of Mayors, which has both adaptation and mitigation elements to it. And so we report on progress against the Global Compact of Mayors, and that is a contribution essentially to both mitigation and adaptation work streams. In terms of the context for why it's called Zero Carbon 2030, on the back of a lot of feedback from the community in 2019, including really some of those first major school strikes for climate rallies, and the requests coming pretty thick and fast from the community, the council declared a climate emergency, and at the same time they brought forward an existing commitment to achieving net neutrality citywide by 20 years. So originally that was a 2050 target, which aligned of course with the government target, but on the back of that climate emergency declaration, they made the call to bring that forward. Like the emissions, the government's emissions reduction target, the city's target is actually in two parts, so it's not entirely net neutrality by 2030. It talks about net zero emissions from all gases other than biogenic methane by 2030. And then in terms of biogenic methane, it aligns with the government's target, that being 24 to 47% below 2017 levels by 2050, and a gross 10% reduction by 2030. I guess just to tease out a little bit what the difference is between those two lines, essentially by adopting a net neutrality target for 2030 for all other gases, that leaves the door open for council to employ offsetting for all gases other than biogenic methane. In terms of that second target, essentially it's setting a hard target for itself. It's saying we will, in real terms, reduce biogenic methane emissions by a hard 10%, and we will not employ offsetting to achieve that. At the same time, council reinforced or recommitted to the development of a plan, an emissions reduction plan for the city. And the latest resolution, they've called it a climate emergency plan. And this is essentially a bit of intended to be a roadmap to deliver that target. The direction from council was to, in this plan, to quantify the actions that might be available at all levels of government, community, to ensure that those targets are met. As well as one last piece of context, I guess, is that as well as this local political mandate or driver to be active in the area of climate change mitigation and adaptation, there is also, in recent months and recent years, I guess, been a real upswing in the degree of government direction around this. So recently, the government passed the Climate Change Response Amendment Act, otherwise known as the Zero Carbon Act. What that did was it embedded in legislation the Zero Carbon 2050 target. It put in place national carbon budgets, or a requirement for national carbon budgets and reporting against those. And that kicks in next calendar year, so 2021. The new government will be faced with the need to start producing and reporting on carbon budgets. That's likely to trickle down locally to local government, but exactly how that will happen is a bit unclear at this point. That Act also put in place some requirements for climate-related disclosure, climate change-related disclosure, for a range of different entities, including local governments. And the Ministry of the Environment, or the Minister for Climate Change, have triggered that as of last month. So local governments are now needing to report or disclose climate-related risk in line with requests from the Ministry. All of this is intended to feed through into the development of a national climate adaptation plan. So the government is really moving quite fast in this area, and there is an increasing need for local government to be responding to these central government requests. I guess another couple of contextual pieces. Obviously, there have also in this last term of government been some tweaks to the emissions trading scheme, which have resulted in rising carbon prices at a local level. That is of particular interest to the Dunedin City Council as an owner and operator of a landfill. We have to pay for emissions associated with that landfill, and so it hits us and ratepayers in the pocket when we have emissions coming from waste. And in addition, in relation to the 10-year plan, and all councils around the country are just heading into this 10-year plan process, the Office of the Auditor General has an auditing function in terms of those plans, takes a really strong interest in them. And what they've come out and said is that they'll be looking for greater emphasis on climate risk and response in those 10-year plans, especially from local authorities that have declared climate emergencies. So I think there are 14 or so TLAs around the country like ourselves that are in that position, that the OAG has said that they're really interested in looking at the content of. So I guess that brings us to the question, what is the challenge? What does it mean to be reducing emissions in Dunedin? And we've just yesterday actually presented an updated emissions profile for the city to councillors. So this is a really timely presentation. I'm just going to give you a very high level overview of that. So this is the updated version is just the second citywide emissions profiling exercise that the city has been through. The first was done in 2016 using 14-15 data, and that's what this slide covers. So it uses a methodology called the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions, otherwise known as the GPC methodology. And this is like our national reporting on emissions. It's production-based rather than consumption-based. So what that means is it excludes embodied emissions in materials or consumer goods that might be manufactured elsewhere and then transported to Dunedin. So the embodied carbon in those is not captured through our methodology. It also excludes biogenic carbon dioxide emissions. So, for example, when firewood is burned, there's an element of carbon dioxide emissions that comes from that. There's also an element of nitrous oxide and methane, I think. Only the methane and the nitrous oxide is captured in that equation. The biogenic CO2 is considered to be short cycle carbon if it comes from sustainably managed plantations. So that is excluded from the city's carbon footprint. There are data gaps, so both in 2014-15 and in our most recent profile, we were limited by the availability of data at a local level. So in some instances, ACOM, who did this work for us, used national data sets and then did a per capita allocation to Dunedin, or used some other allocation factor that was considered appropriate. I can get the full report to anyone that's interested to go through that full range of assumptions and exclusions, but I just thought it was important to touch on the methodology. In terms of what they discovered in 2016 when they first did this work, they discovered that gross emissions totaled 1.6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Per capita emissions sat at around 12.6 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per person. Agriculture, which was the largest part of the pie, so the majority of that is from livestock. 35% of the inventory showed up as transport emissions, so that included marine transport, land transport, air transport. 13% came from stationary energy, so both electricity use and the likes of fossil fuels that are burnt locally for the purpose of generating heat or electricity. 8% waste to landfill, and a very, very small part of that waste pie is also wastewater treatment. And then 2% from industrial chemicals. That last piece is very much a national picture that has been brought back to a Dunedin level. The reason for that is because there's just no data on the likes of flame retardant use in Dunedin that is able to be accessed. So jump forward 4 years, the most recent data that was available at the time that we commenced this work with ACOM was from the 2018-19 full year. Emissions have increased by 4% overall. When you look at that per capita, it is still an increase, albeit a slightly lower increase. So rather than 4% increase, we're now looking at 3% increase, but still an increase. In terms of what is driving that increase, the biggest shift came from transport. So over 4 years, fuel sales jumped up 30% in Dunedin City, which is a massive increase. The majority of that shift came from petrol and diesel, so land transport fuel sales, but marine transport emissions and aviation related emissions also grew. In terms of agriculture, it's now in second place. So there has actually been a reduction in emissions from agriculture based on a reduction in livestock numbers across the district. Still, pretty much all of that comes directly from livestock. In terms of stationary energy, the greening of the grid has really helped us, but because a proportion of the local fuel sales are attributed to local energy use or stationary energy use, that has been more than offset. So that greening of the grid is more than offset by an increase in local fuel sales. Not such great news on that front, but it's marginal. It's around the edges. In terms of waste, the team out at Green Island have been putting in a lot of put a lot of emphasis recently on trying to improve the gas collection system out there. that gas is collected and goes through a generation process to create energy, which is then used to power Green Island wastewater treatment plant, and some of it is also exported to grid. And in recent years, a lot more gas is being collected out there, which in turn means that we have a reduction in methane emissions and a reduction in our footprint. There's been a very small national decrease in industrial chemical use, which in turn has translated through to our footprint. So I guess that's the big picture. Obviously, this accounting methodology also looks at net emissions. This methodology applies land use accounting conventions under the UNFCCC. So it looks at changes in forest stocks. It doesn't take into account the likes of ownership or whether any of the forests that sit within Dunedin district might be ETS registered and being claimed by someone else for offsetting purposes. So in my view, this net position really needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But essentially under this methodology, Dunedin has 15% forest cover, a lot of that in native, some of it in exotics. And taking that into account, it does reduce our net emissions down to something like 1.3 million tonnes of CO2 in 2018-19. That is actually an increase of 6% since 2014-15. And that change is basically because there's been more harvest activity in the 2018-19 year than there was in the 14-15 year. Just an equally quick, or possibly even faster overview of the DCC's organisational emissions. So as owner and operator of the DCC's, of the Green Island landfill, all of the waste that ends up in the landfill, irrespective of where it comes from, is essentially attributed to the DCC's organisational footprint. So 80% of the DCC's organisational footprint is from waste. Again, the methodology here is slightly different. It's certified, the DCC is certified in accordance with ISO 1464. That doesn't capture, again, there are a whole range of exclusions. It doesn't capture emissions from purchased goods and services. It excludes a bunch of major contracts that we have, so the likes of wastewater contracts or water maintenance contracts, parks and reserves maintenance contracts are all essentially sitting on the books of other entities. That's something that we're looking at, but at the moment that's the position. In terms of our largest emission source, I'm going to switch over to another view of it because basically you can't see any of the detail when 80% of this pie graph is waste. What it does mean that major emission source is that it basically drives any changes in the overall profile of the DCC's emissions. So as you can see, DCC's emissions so far, and since we started measuring them, the peak was in 2017-18. That coincides with Fairfield landfill closing and some additional waste coming to Green Island landfill. Subsequently, an operator started transferring waste out of the district, and that resulted in a fall in DCC emissions. When waste is excluded from the analysis, essentially it's basically the same as our emissions as an organisation are essentially equivalent to what they were in 2013-14 when we first started measuring. This is the rest of the pie, so excluding waste, you can see that the major users really are, or the major emission sources are electricity, followed by LPG use, which is primarily in stationary energy use, diesel, that is used for stationary energy purposes, followed by air travel, hydrofluorocarbons, which are refrigerants, wastewater treatment processes, and then fleet use a few other little rats and mice down the bottom there. Interestingly, the largest electricity user in the city is streetlights. It's enormous when you consider it all together, and we have got a major project underway around those, so that's likely to be shrinking in the next couple of years. Tahuna wastewater treatment plant is the next largest electricity user, and the team's actively looking at some stuff in that space too. In terms of LPG use, we've got a major investigation underway looking at possible alternatives or ways to displace that LPG use. There's a collaborative project with a number of stakeholders, including the university and the SCHB, as they also have carbon emissions from energy use that they would like to be displacing. So I guess just briefly now, I'm going to have to be super quick here, but I've just got a couple of slides on the 10-year plan process to give you guys a high-level view of some of the stuff that we're doing internally to help our councillors, help support councillors' decisions on this come December and January, which is when they will be making big calls. So we're updating the organisation's emissions reduction plan, and some of those initiatives that I've briefly highlighted there will be in that plan. We're doing a Climate 2030 rapid review across the organisation, looking at opportunities to align the council's work programme with the DCC's 2030 emissions target. Ultimately, the shape of both of those, both the emissions reduction plan and the 10-year plan, will depend a lot on these 10-year plan decisions. But in order to support those decisions, we're doing a high-level emissions impact assessment of proposed expenditure. So when proposed expenditure goes up to council, there will also be a high-level qualitative assessment of the potential impact on citywide emissions and council emissions. We're putting together a draft work program and budget for the zero carbon work that we need to do to develop a citywide plan and other kind of partnership work over the next few years that will go up to council for consideration at the same time. We're considering zero carbon implications for our draft infrastructure and financial strategies, and that will be reflected in the drafts that go up to council for consideration. And in some of the early engagement around the 10-year plan that you guys might have seen signalled very recently in the media, there is a zero carbon focus that's being foreshadowed. In terms of next steps, that December meeting that I've talked about, we're also looking at introducing climate impact statement, mandatory climate impact statements into all council reporting, so that each decision that councillors have will have a climate impact assessment to assist their decision making. And we're looking at developing a climate policy for the council, which will cover issues like climate projections that might be mandatory for embedding in all business cases, or the likes of a carbon price that might be required to be embedded in all business cases or project assessments that are done. And again, just very briefly, we're looking at, or as of yesterday, council has signed off on the concept of replacing what some of you guys might have been familiar with in the Dunedin Energy Leaders Accord that was launched in 2015 and intended to do some really great work around energy outcomes, but essentially it's been a bit inactive. So the opportunity is to refocus that group. Start with probably a smaller group in the first instance and then expand out to a larger group of stakeholders, but to have a more of an emissions focus for that group. Obviously energy will be a key component of the work that we do together, but to embed that focus within each of the organisations' work on emissions, which is now core business really for a lot of these stakeholders. So that was signed off by council yesterday, and we'll be able to get on with designing in terms of reference for that. Shout out to Ray, who's been working on that with me from the NS perspective, and I see he's on the call. In terms of getting to a zero carbon plan for the city, that's basically next year's job. Once we've got over this 10-year plan hump, we're really starting to focus now on partnerships, working across the city, working with stakeholders, early next year we'll be starting some of these conversations about how we're going to deliver on this emissions target, following the footsteps, I guess, of a number of councils around the country that have done this work. Most recently, Auckland and Queenstown have launched these. I see Rotorua Lakes has also launched one in the last, or a draft in the last couple of days, which I haven't yet had the opportunity to review, but it's really great to have best practice from other parts of the country to draw on. And definitely the key message is take the time to do it well, take the time to do it with stakeholders. It needs absolutely everybody to be on board to deliver these outcomes. So that's what we'll be doing over the next year if we get that mandate from council in terms of ongoing budget. Sean, I think I'm sorry, that's taken long, definitely longer than 20 minutes, but hopefully no more than 25 or 27. And yeah, look forward to any questions that people have.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. Gives us a really great overview of sort of the kinds of commitments, but also the challenge that we're faced in meeting those commitments. So yeah, I'd like to open it up to questions or comments. You can feel free to use the chat box to indicate you want to ask a question, or otherwise raise your hand. I don't know how to do that, but I know some people do, and I'll call on you and you can ask your question directly.
Just while that's happening, Sean, I guess I also said that I'd talk about energy and completely ran out of time to do that, but just to flag up in the energy space, as well as the regular Dunedin energy study, which the Centre for Sustainability does for the council every year. That's an ongoing commitment. In the last 12 months, we've really had a very strong focus on investigating a possible district heating scheme expansion or replacement with a range of different stakeholders, and those conversations now coming to a head, which is really great in terms of a time frame. So that's been a strong focus. We're also about to embark on an EV charge infrastructure plan for the city, which is also likely to kind of to have a brief look at hydrogen technology and the role that might have. The government pushing that quite hard, so we wanted to look at both of those things in an integrated way. So I guess those are kind of the key pieces of work that are underway in the energy kind of space, so if there are questions about that as well.
So I've got a question from Ray and then one from Janet. Go ahead, Ray.
On your emissions profile, where do you think are the quick wins that we'll be able to get some knocked off as a city, and where do you think are the real areas of resistance that we need to get everybody around the table to knock out?
That's a great question, Ray. You mean the citywide profile?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I found it really helpful getting this profile because it showed to me that unless we do something fairly drastic in the area of transport, that's going to be a losing battle for us. And I think councillors really appreciated seeing that reality as well yesterday. It's a helpful contextual piece for their decision making in December and January. Given that a lot of those major transport projects, they do have quite a long lead-in time, so knowing how important that is quite critical to the decision making. So I guess the big wins would be in transport and in land use planning. The council is also going through the process of looking at how it might provide for growth in the future, and my advice to councillors has been the decisions that they make in that area will have serious ramifications for the future emissions profile of the city. So that, I guess that's the kind of the two big areas in terms of quick wins. My sense is that quick wins are possibly more in the stationary energy space. The lead time on switching out boilers doesn't seem to be as long as some of those transport projects. and there are already such productive conversations underway between major stakeholders in that area that I think there's quite a lot of room there for some early movement. Similarly, in the waste space, the team here, obviously with the landfill closing in 2023, there is a need, it's really timely to be considering alternative waste solutions, and embedding an emissions focus at the centre of decision making around those would, I think, enable some relatively quick wins to flow through.
Great. Janet? And then we've got a question from Robert afterwards.
Thanks. And thank you, Jinty. That was really interesting to see it all laid out in one place. That was excellent. I've actually just got kind of, it's two questions, but one is because you referred to it earlier, you were going to say a bit more about the rapid review, and so I wondered whether you'd be able to just catch us up with briefly where you've got to with that. The other was I'm intrigued by the fact that of the you're accounting for forestry, but not accounting for those forests that are already committed under the ETS. And I wondered whether that was a piece of work that was being planned, or how you were going to address that differential.
Yeah, really good questions, Janet. So the rapid review piece, that's had a lot of publicity. It's, I guess my sense of that is it's one of a number of pieces of work that we have going on across the organisation that are all leading up to, all working towards supporting Council's decisions in December. So we'll be reporting that rapid review, the outcomes of that rapid review to them alongside the other pieces of work that we've been doing, and essentially synthesising the findings for them in a report in December. But for those who maybe aren't so familiar with the rapid review, essentially Council in December, before I was actually even here, identified the need for a piece of work to be done looking across the organisation at alignment of existing work programs with climate related ambitions, whether that was adaptation or mitigation. So the policy team, I think at the time, felt that there was, even within Council, a really limited sense of the degree to which existing work programs aligned or didn't align. And so this rapid review was, in the first instance, designed to be a stocktake of what is already happening, and then a bit of a gap analysis, looking at where the major gaps were, and maybe the areas that needed significant focus, to inform some of the forward conversations around achieving that net neutrality target, but also work in the adaptation space. And so for me, probably the most useful thing that has come out of the rapid review is the opportunity to, it's been led by an external provider, but policy and I have been party to all of those conversations, and having the opportunity to really have an in-depth conversation with pretty much every team across the organisation about their role in business, in amending business as usual to deliver on climate ambitions. That's been a really valuable experience. So that's a little bit about the rapid review. Can you remind me of your second question? Oh, forestry. Forestry, yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been a fascinating experience learning about these different methodologies and the way that they treat things differently. Yeah, that if we are to stick with our existing methodology, which is that GPC methodology, that is the way that they deliver a net assessment of emissions within the city. Yeah, yeah. So obviously there are some issues with that, and if the city were to go down the route of offsetting its emissions to achieve its target, which I think probably wouldn't be the first place that we would be looking anyway, but if that were something that Council has decided that they wanted to do, then it would be the gross emissions number that would be used for the purposes of establishing offsetting requirements, not the net position.
A couple more transport-related questions from Robert. Is there a council plan to procure and resell EVs as a way to reduce the city's own and community transport emissions?
Yes, so within the DCC, we do have an emissions reduction plan as an organisation. I would say up until probably last year, really, when this citywide climate change work program was established, that emissions reduction plan didn't get a whole lot of daylight. So there's been a strong focus over the last year in our refresh of that plan at making sure that it's going to act as a living document from now on in. One of the existing commitments that has sat within the city's, the council's commitment to emissions reduction has been a commitment to, I think, have 20 EVs within the council fleet by, I think, 2022. And the last advice that went to council on that a couple of months ago is that we're on track to achieve that target. They are all light vehicles, and a lot of them were initially procured through second-hand channels. My understanding is that that has become more difficult or possibly impossible due to the council's participation in an all of government vehicles contract. So any government or any vehicles are now purchased through alternative approaches. So I think not second-hand.
So, sorry, just to add to my point, given that you've called an emergency and a 10-year deadline, normal churn of vehicles just isn't going to cut it. It's not even going to touch the edge. So I know it was mooted a long time ago that government in various forms would be a facilitator. Essentially, it's a backdoor subsidy to get electric vehicles into the community. It's just because that's the way you achieve attack that transmission percentage aggressively. Because if you wait until people just change their cars, it just doesn't cut it. That was my point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. To date, council hasn't given us any direction about leading a program of that nature, and certainly that would need to be a council decision rather than something that was instigated by staff.
So another question around sort of influencing or changing behavior. Does the transportation plan include a more realistic charges for congestion and parking that are heavily subsidized at the moment, or give the wrong sort of incentive?
Yeah, interesting question. So one of the key pieces of feedback that has come through or is coming through the rapid review is that there is a need to for council to carefully consider the balance of incentives in the transport space. That will be any changes to parking are a decision for council, but the transport team, I think, as well have signalled that there is a need to review parking across the city as part of their forward work program. So the direction of that will be informed or taken, or decisions on the direction of that will be taken by council in the coming months.
Just to elaborate, can you hear me?
Yep.
Shifts the investment you have in transport, changes the consumption patterns and the carbon emissions very greatly, and that subsidy is huge. And the DCC could do something to do more realistic charging, such as a congestion charging and a realistic parking charge. If you look at the cost of a parking blocking alternative transport routes, an alternative transport route would cost millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to get the road corridor, and that's being given away free to parking. If you charge for these things, suddenly the balance would turn around, and people would not take for granted the right to sort of drive around. They think they have to actually pay for it.
Yeah, I think the point is well made, and as I say, it's the need to consider the balance of incentives is certainly something that that is coming through clearly in the review work that has been done to date. But again, I'm just an officer, I'm not a decision maker, and so council will be making decisions about the relative priority of various different projects over the coming months.
Any other questions or comments?
I had another question, Jinty. You mentioned in your talk about pricing carbon in different work streams, and I just wondered, could you elaborate on that? Is that about a notional price of carbon to assess one investment against another, or is that effectively virtually charging the project for its emissions, or something else?
Yeah, really great question, Robert. The driver for this comes from conversations with infrastructure teams about how they operationalise a target like the Zero Carbon 2030 target. So they obviously go through for each of their prospective projects. They will assess the benefits and costs of a project from a number of different perspectives, and one of those, which I guess the organisation is now asking them to consider, is carbon. But they struggle to do that in the absence of having a metric or a guide as to how much that should be weighted. So there is a lot of work that needs to happen in this area, and I am no expert in carbon pricing, but certainly the intention is to work up a draft climate policy that, and as part of that, to look at or possible approaches to reflect the cost of inaction to council as part of business cases for particular projects. Again, that would be a council decision, a political decision about how that is priced, the various different pricing mechanisms or options that might be available to us would all be considered by council as well, and an approach decided on as part of that climate policy discussion.
I think it's a great start for projects to know what their cost, what their CO2 contribution is in terms of tons and over lifetimes and things. And then it allows decision makers to make informed decisions rather than just intuitive or gut decisions or favorite project decisions. So, and if you cause the projects to pay for it in some virtual form, like a monopoly kind of market, then council can make decisions what to offset and what to not to do, and when to invest further to reduce the carbon content, because lots of these things, it actually requires extra investment to reduce the carbon output. It's a good initiative, but it will take a lot of work to get it worked through.
Yes, there's a lot of complexity. It's something that this entire work program is not short of.
I guess I just have a comment / question, and I think it relates to, you made the point around sort of needing to think more about land use and land use decisions, and I think it's what you've presented here provides an excellent sort of starting point or institutional framework going forward. But of course, the decisions that we've made over the last 10 years are locking us into a particular emission profile into the future. And so how do we reconcile those kind of challenges given the urgency, and 2030 is only 10 years away?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Sean. I spent a lot of time at council yesterday answering questions on 4 different reports that councillors were considering, and a common theme from councillors was how realistic is this zero carbon 2030 target that we've set. And I mean, I don't think it's possible to answer that at this point, because we haven't done the modelling that tells us what would need to be achieved in order to get that, to get those emissions down so significantly in such a short period of time. And we also haven't, council hasn't made any decisions about offsetting. They've essentially left the door open for it, but they haven't you know, decided that it's in or out as a mechanism. So until those kind of policy decisions, until that modelling is done, I think it's very difficult to get a sense of, or for me to answer with any confidence questions around achievability. Certainly it is highly ambitious as a target. And I guess my response to councillors yesterday, as well as making those points, was to say, look, it is certainly highly ambitious, and whether or not we'll achieve it is at this point unclear. But what it has achieved, what is very clear is that setting that target, that 2030 target, has generated a degree of emphasis on this topic that would not otherwise have been the case, and it has generated momentum around doing something which would not otherwise be happening. So from that perspective, I think the target setting can be assessed a success at this point. From that perspective, whether or not we look at it in 2030 and say we've got net neutrality, I think there's a completely different question. And I think the broader question that you're asking is, you know, when these things take such a long time to flow through, how do we not feel disheartened by increasing emissions for, say, a period of time, even after we've started seriously focusing our energies on decreasing emissions? And I think that that's a bigger challenge. I think that is, in the eyes of the public, that is a really big challenge. Yeah.
Great, yeah, that was excellent. Any last questions or comments? So, a comment from Robert again. Are you connecting with entities already looking at hydrogen as longer-term CO2 mitigation? For example, Port of Auckland, Haringa, etc.
Yeah, so we had a really interesting presentation from Haringa quite recently, which has prompted a lot of internal conversations about hydrogen, and yeah, it's certainly an emerging area of interest and discussion here at the council. It does seem that the extent to which it is exploitable, you know, it has its own little niche, doesn't it? So it's interesting as to how it fits into that sort of picture, and it's one of the reasons why we've included, or why we're looking to include a piece on that in our EV charge infrastructure plan, because we want to understand how those technologies might integrate with one another, and the ramifications of having multiple emerging possible technologies in the transport space. So I would say it's early days at the DCC around hydrogen, but certainly there's a lot of interest and a lot of conversations at an early stage.
Well, I'll extend an invitation. If you want to see a working system that we've had at Gracefield and Lower Hutt since 2016, you're welcome to come and visit anytime.
Thanks very much, Robert. That's super kind.
Cool.
Sorry. Well, I think we'll leave it there. I think the last thing to do is just if everyone could join me in a virtual round of applause for Jinty. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. And hopefully
thanks, Sean, and yeah, thanks for having me on. And just again, like to acknowledge that this work is or the work that I'm doing builds on work that has been done by a lot of people over a number of years, and a number of them are on this call. So thanks to those who have been contributing to the energy and zero carbon agenda, whether it's as an active citizen or as a researcher, in positions of office with other organisations. Really appreciate the contributions you've made, and look forward to continuing to work together as we strive to achieve the Council's goal of net neutrality by 2030.
Great, thanks very much.
Mm.